This is Jeffrey Tucker. Today, my special guest is Steve Deace, who runs a very popular podcast, and he's probably one of the few other people in the world who has followed this the COVID situation as closely as I have over 6 years. And right now, I'm very pleased to say we're in a interesting time where the topic of COVID-19 is suddenly trending again, which I think is excellent. We need an accounting for what happened to this country during that period, all the destruction, the violations of rights, the deployment of fake science in the service of something. It's taken me years to figure out what that might be. Steve and I today are going to compare notes on that. My own theory, after having made a full list of about 10 possible theories on what was really going on, probably some 5 years ago, has come down to one or two in my own mind. But let's just kind of quickly recount what's happened in the last several days. We had David Morens, Dr. David Morens, over at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, serving under Fauci, has been indicted and will be tried and probably will either. My guess is that he's going to sing and avoid jail time, but he is a guy who definitely knows where all the bodies are buried. He served with Fauci for 24 years. Fauci recruited him out of CDC. He's a very loyal and faithful servant to a man he probably came to despise, but was very instrumental in the cover-up of the lab leak. And his services were engaged pretty early on, let's say the fourth week of January, if not earlier. And he was also the co-author of one of the scariest, weirdest papers to ever appear in the academic literature, an August 2020 Cell article, in which he and Fauci said that civilization has been going wrong for 21,000 years. The first time human beings learned to travel from spot to spot and infect each other with diseases for which they blamed everything from the Black Death to cholera to COVID, and recommended dramatic changes in the structure of civilization itself, heavily implying that we should never again gather in groups, meaning church services, much less baseball games, and that we shouldn't be allowed to own pets either, because those will infect us. The big theory of the paper is that we've got a problem with increasing numbers of viruses leaping from animals to humans. Of course, this theory was in service of the idea of a zoonotic release of COVID-19 that really helped reinforce that narrative and distract from the actual reality of a lab leak that was funded by an NIH grant that Fauci was covering up. And David Morens, made the mistake. He's now 78 years old, and he's clearly got, let's just say, he's got an affection for martinis. He was a little too blunt in his emails and said, "I've found a great way to avoid FOIAs, and so I've created a Gmail account. They'll never figure that out." And so he was sort of caught, and is being prosecuted for those reasons alone. But that's just Morens. We've got other things going on. The James Comey has been re-indicted, and everybody's forgotten this fact. But Comey was fired by the Deputy Assistant Attorney General, whose name was Rod Rosenstein, whose sister is Nancy Messonnier, who worked at CDC, who was the very first CDC employee to brief the press on February 24th, 2020, about the coming lockdowns, without ever having even asked the Trump administration. So is there a relationship between Trump's firing of Comey from the FBI director and the lockdowns, that the man who was pressed into service to fire his boss, as the sister of that man, was the one who was pleased to tell the New York Times about the coming lockdowns, causing them to switch editorial positions 3 days later? about the same time as the junket from Wuhan returned from a World Health Organization Potemkin Village tour, showing how well CCP managed the virus with lockdowns. These are all very interesting issues, but there is a Comey connection. And now we've got some talk about Ralph Barrick. Journalist Paul Thacker, on good authority, claims that Barrick, the UNC Chapel Hill, probably the inventor of this virus, most likely, has been put on leave of absence from the university and been cut off of all NIH grants and hasn't been heard from in a while. And growing pressure to arrest Fauci for his clear act of perjury in front of the U.S. Senate. We apparently have 2 weeks left in that for the statute of limitations to run out. And this would put a test to Trump's theory that none of Biden's executive orders are valid because they're all signed with an auto pen, among which we could include Biden's pardon for Fauci himself. So there's a lot of things happening. So I'm really looking forward to this time to work with Steve here and see if we can sort some of this out. Steve, welcome. So glad to have you here. Glad to have your thoughts on anything I said. If I said anything wrong, you're the perfect one to correct it.
I was going to go to you for corrections, Jeff. So I came here for you to correct me. But, that as I listen to that, it reminds me, as I get older, there's just certain albums, you haven't played them in a while. You throw in a Back in Black, you throw in a Dark Side of the Moon. I haven't listened to that stuff in a while, but I'd still remember all the lyrics to all the songs. And that's how I feel about your setup right there. Like I did these shows like every day for 5-6 years ago. Just throw that CD back in, man, and I still know all the lyrics, all the words. All right, they're all coming. It's all coming back to me now. And I think this would be just so peak this era if this entire house of cards that Fauci and his ilk constructed to hide what truly happened with this virus and how it happened. For this entire thing to just fall apart because a 78-year-old dude couldn't keep his mouth shut in Gmails and literally wrote in emails, "There's no paper trail. There's no paper trail. My boss got away with it all." All right. And he literally wrote that down like, okay, well, now we got a paper trail. So thanks. You stop and you think about, I have 300,000 followers on X, 170,000 followers on Facebook, 500,000 people listen to my podcast every day. And YouTube wants to tell me I have 22,000 subscribers. I'm still getting censored. I've got 16 state attorney generals sending legal notices on my behalf to YouTube for all the censorship going back to the reporting on the things that you just talked about at the time that they happened. And so they constructed a censorship regime. You had Alex Berenson's successful lawsuit against that, and he proved that was being done to him at the direction all the way up to the White House. Think about it, Jeffrey. Everything they put into place to cover all of this up. All right. They denied literally 300 years of what we know about natural immunity, not to mention thousands of years of how did human civilization survive plagues before we had vaccines in the 18th century. What did we do? Everything they did. They took the New York Times, who used to be skeptical of corporations and was then just, ripping and reading Pfizer press releases on the front page as if it was just unskeptical news. One of my favorite skits of the COVID era, the comedian Ryan Long put on a Pfizer shirt. And he went out on the streets and he asked liberals, "Hey, do you hate corporations?" And they all said yes. But he said, "But what about Pfizer?" And they all said, "No, except for Pfizer. Pfizer can do to me whatever they want. All the other corporations are terrible, but Pfizer, I'm their lab rat." Right? All of that, for that all to come down, for the cow to be that kicks over Mrs. O'Leary's lantern that starts the whole fire here is an approaching 80-year-old dude literally wrote in emails, "They'll never catch us." It's just hilarious to me.
There's other things, Steve, too. I'm sure there must have been at some point in the last 6 years when you thought you were going crazy.
Yes, many points.
What I started wondering when New York Times put out a story that said, as it turns out, 90% of the cases in a sample we looked at COVID were not really cases.
Oh, the PCR testing article. So this is so you're gonna love. This is when Facebook permanently. This is when Facebook permanently struck my page for posting an article I didn't write from the New York Times. Yes, that's yes.
That was our PERVA, and her point was that the PCR cycle rate was too high, and that these were not medically significant cases. They were just merely exposures, maybe, or infections, maybe. And we used to distinguish between infections and cases, but all those categories were just smashed into one thing. So when you would follow the data, it looked like the whole country was getting sick, and that wasn't. Everybody was desperately ill, and that wasn't true. And so that was weird because I thought, well, why would public health be using a test that is not anywhere near accurate, and they surely must know that. That was strange. And then you had the press conference with Deborah Birx, where she said, I think for purposes of listing the cause of death, we're considering anybody who died with COVID to have died of COVID. Do you remember that?
I do. Oh, yes.
Yeah. So now you've got
in my fever dreams, you bet I do. Yes.
Yeah. So now we've got rampant misclassification of death. So now now suddenly we don't know how many people actually have medically significant COVID. We don't know the difference between an exposure and infection in a case. And we don't even know, even to this day, how many people actually died of COVID.
It's crazy. And, for people that don't remember how those PCR tests work, essentially you can just keep zooming in times infinity until you find something, right? It's a little bit like I just spent 5 days in Alexandria, Virginia, had a couple events in D.C., and the wife and I decided to make it a longer trip. We've gone there so many times on business, we've never had a chance to go sightseeing. So we thought, let's take a couple days and do that, right? I'm sure if they took one of those hotel taverns there in historic Alexandria that's been there since the late 18th century and zoomed in a million times, you'd find residue on the carpet for some consummation of a marriage that occurred in 1789. I'm sure if you went looking for it, you would find it. And that's essentially what they did. And the New York Times called them on that and said, hey, why are we zooming in 10,000 times, all right, looking for something? And then some of us got in trouble for posting an article written by the New York Times. And that's just one. And that, to me, this is the thing about this. And I often get criticized for why I don't follow into conspiracy theories where Tyler Robinson and my friend Charlie Kirk's murder is concerned. And people will say things to me all the time, Jeffrey, like, what happened to you since COVID? And I said, maybe you didn't understand what I did during COVID. What I did during COVID was take their data. I can't do a seroprevalence test. I have no means to do that. I met Jay Bhattacharya because he did one of the very first ones at Stanford University in the spring of 2020. That's how him and I first met. I did this really complicated thing, Jeffrey, where I went on the Dutch National Health Advisory Board's website, where they published all their own stratified data on COVID. And I ran it into Google Translate into English so I could understand it. And then now follow me here. Here's what I did. I then reported on what it said. That's what I did. I use their actual data. That's the great fallacy of all of this, is they did publish. CDC was publishing mortality data and stratified by age and mortality and demographic. They were doing it the whole time. But the media blacked it out, acted like they weren't doing it, didn't cover any of it. And then the social media companies came in and punished people like us if we put it up on our pages for our audiences to see. The official data was actually there the entire time. And the greatest confirmation of this, and I'll never forget this, Jeffrey, the rest of my life. August 8th of 2021, Rochelle Walensky goes on, who's head of the CDC at the time, goes on CNN. Now, since it was CNN, I understand a lot of people probably didn't see it, okay? But she went on CNN talking to Wolf Blitzer, and she admitted that people who are fully vaccinated can now get and spread the virus. She admitted this on August 8th of 2021. Almost exactly 30 days later, September 7th, 2021, I think it was, is when Biden signed that ill-fated executive order demanding that if you worked for a company of 100 or more employees, you had to get the COVID vaccine or you couldn't work. A month after his own CDC director admitted on national television, It doesn't even work. He
doesn't
still
even
signed
work.
that executive order anyway. And that is
Yeah.
something to me that's the peak of the tyranny of that era. And those are the two dates I'll never forget the rest of my life.
Well, thanks for reminding me of those 2 dates. I'm not sure I had those in my mind. I need to add that to my catalog of significant times. So what that meant was that after Walensky said that the shot itself would be lacking in any kind of public health benefit, right?
What it means is even before we get to the constitutional questions people like you and I would be concerned about, there's not even a public health case for this. It doesn't even work. It doesn't even work. And they knew it.
Even then, there might have been a private benefit, in which case you would say, well, I think you should get it anyway, but it's not going to slow infections. It's not going to stop transmission. That would have been the honest thing to say, but that's not what they said.
I knew it wasn't working in the summer because I was going to all the state health departments. They were all publishing their data, and they would tell you COVID cases, jabbed or unjabbed, and you were starting to see state by. I was just putting this stuff on social media all the time. Yeah. You could just link back to the state health departments, and as early as July, they were showing you that like 25-30% of their cases were people that were jabbed. As early as July, they were showing this.
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, that itself should not have been a surprise unless you were paying no attention at all to middle school virology primers. During which time I think we were supposed to learn that you can't, a cold is not something against which you could vaccinate because it mutates too quickly and it has a zoonotic reservoir in it. And so there's some viruses that can be controlled through vaccination and others you cannot. The common cold, there are two varieties of common cold, one of which is called a coronavirus. So it was never the case that this was a disease against which one could vaccinate in any kind of sterilizing sense. So this was, again, already known by anybody who wanted to download a copy of Viruses for Dummies from Amazon. So that was frustrating. And it was about that time, I think, that we started getting reports of the bad safety profile of the vaccines too. And I didn't want to believe them, by the way. I wasn't quick to go, yeah, see, your product's poison. That wasn't me.
Right.
I waited and only until it was affirmed to me by a person who would definitely know. A person who's very much pro-vaccine, but is probably considers himself to be the world's leading expert on vaccine safety, told me that after all the athletic deaths, that we had a major problem on our hands. And so that's when I started taking it seriously.
I wasn't rooting against it because it was pretty clear that this was their master plan, was to introduce this line of technology and all other therapies and treatments be damned. And so if that was clearly the plan, was to integrate us with this technology, my fear was if it actually was failing, as I feared, that it would actually mean they were going to try to lock us all down and go back to the drawing board all over again and make this indefinite. And so, no, I was not rooting against it either, but I will tell you from the very beginning, when I watched this roll out, the fact that the last national seroprevalence study we got from CDC was in the summer of 2020, and it was data from May. And then the fact that they didn't update that at all to see who already had natural immunity. I mean, traditionally, when we've done vaccine rollouts for these kinds of pandemic level events, you vaccinate people that don't have natural immunity because the people who have natural immunity already have immunity. And so you vaccinate the others who don't have immunity to try to get to herd immunity as fast as you possibly can. The fact that they said, hey, even if you have natural immunity, you should go get vaccinated, meant one of two things to me. And it was possible that both were true. It meant that, number one, that this was a vaccination scheme in search of a pandemic from the very beginning. That this was really about this is always about trying to get us onto this technology for whatever nefarious reasons that they really wanted it. And number two, that this thing was absolutely not natural, was not zoonotic. It was completely and totally synthetic and man-made, and that they feared, therefore, because it was some kind of chimeric Frankenstein they made in a lab, they really weren't sure what natural laws of immunology, virology, biology that it was beholden to. That's and that they might have just let Captain Trips out into the population and they weren't sure. All right. Yeah. And that was the other factor to me.
I had not ever thought of that, but that actually would explain why there seemed to be actually sincere doubts about natural immunity. If they thought that it really was a lab-created virus, that it would defy all the rules about immunity, that would make sense. Yeah.
And that's where, the two other dates to me that will always be memorable in this conversation. And I used to ask this question on my show all of the time. And we brought this up as a central thesis in our #1 bestseller, Fauci and Bargain, about this back in 2021. On February 28th of 2020, Anthony Fauci co-authored a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, basically calming fears about COVID-19 coming out of China.
February 28th?
February 28th. Of the last day of February in 2020.
Presumably written several weeks earlier.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, to make publication. Yep. And if you go back and read that data, essentially everything he predicted from an IFR standpoint is almost exactly what ended up turning out to be true. All right. And then suddenly, it's March 11th was the date that he went to Congress and gave that literally the sky is falling testimony. We're abandon hope, all ye who enter. And by March 16th, the entire country was shut down. The NCAA tournament's canceled. Everything's closed, right? And I've always wondered, and I used to ask my audience all the time, what did he learn between the publication of that piece in the New England Journal of Medicine and his congressional testimony? And I came to the conclusion that what he learned was, oh, bleep, this is not the China virus. This is the most favored nation global partnership creation we've all been working on since the last MERS and SARS level event. A lot of people don't know they tried to find a vaccine for SARS-1 for over a decade and kept failing over and over again and finally quit. The funding dried up. They were now preemptively trying to figure out what would cause another SARS-MERS level event.
I think it's let's just kind of discuss this timeline briefly because Jeremy Farrar in his book Spiked, and I think this is corroborated by other people too, says that they began to suspect a lab leak in the last week of January, right? And then that's when they commissioned the paper Proximal Origins of COVID. And that paper, I guess, came out in draft just a few weeks later, right? And then eventually appears in Nature, I'm going to say, probably first or second week in March. Okay.
And then none of us were allowed to talk about it. Was it Vanity Fair that was allowed to break the seal? I think it was Vanity Fair, or that did the first feature in late 2020 that pointed back to a lab leak, I think is what happened, or early 21. Yeah.
Yeah, even though they were suspicious of it. Now, if you think about it, we've only got about 2 weeks time between the period of panic where they're on burner phones, they're holding clandestine calls, they're warning their friends and family that if something should happen to me, it's not because I committed suicide or whatever Farrar wrote in his book. So we only got about 2 weeks time in there between that very hot period where they were panicked about the possible lab leak. By the way, I don't know if you can believe any of this stuff, right? It's possible they knew about.
They just retconned all of this in response to what they knew was going to come out later.
Yeah,
correct?
I mean, they may have known already in September of 2019, for all I know. I don't know, but if you're going to take the official timeline, they're all panicked the last week of February. So here's where I think. I have to get a little bit theoretical, and I'll just tell you how I've resolved it in my own mind. How do we jump from fear of lab leak to, we have to lock down the country? And my only working hypothesis here is that they were so desperate to cover up the fact that they might be responsible for a global pandemic through their funding, that they thought the way out of it was to use plans that were sort of not, on the top shelf. I mean, they were there, but they weren't really the idea of locking down for a pandemic virus had been circulating for the previous 15 years or so, but nobody really ever took them seriously. But now, if you could lock down the country and try out a new technology that Fauci had been working on since the AIDS epidemic 20, 30 years earlier, whatever it was, the FDA never approved the mRNA. But if you could lock down the country and deploy a vaccine rather quickly was using mRNA technology that bypassed the FDA, then you could get your $1 trillion products in circulation. So what would be the purpose of the lockdowns, though? And here's where it gets a little speculative. My thought was that maybe there was a belief that if we could stop crowds from meeting, if we could, keep people from going to church, get everybody to hide, under their sofas for as long as possible, we could delay herd immunity, delay endemicity, and then when the shot rolls out, the shot would get full credit for having ended the pandemic. What is your thought about that theory?
I think I think that's very possible. I think they knew it was a lab leak all along. I think they thought they were going to be able to blame it on China, that China maliciously did it. Remember the World Military Games, the Olympics of World Militaries was held in Wuhan, China in the fall of 2019. Yeah. So that would have been a perfect moment in order. I think a lot of people think that Wuhan is some desolate area. It's not. It's one of the 15 most densely populated regions on this planet. And there's 3 of these labs, by the way, in that community, not just one. And so I think maybe we thought that China had done this. Remember, now go back to 2018 and 2019, right? And you'll know this because you're an economics guy. All right. China was facing as much civil unrest as it had since Tiananmen Square. You had the protest in Hong Kong. You had the trade war there was at least a draw in the trade war against Trump. And so they're facing serious threats to some of their hegemony and their ability to steal intellectual property and everything else that has propped them up for decades. And they've got some unrest now here at home. And so the world brings its military personnel to Wuhan, China, where they can leak this thing out of a lab and go out and spread it to the rest of the world. It's incredible luck that right when China was kind of feeling some domestic heat for the first time in about 25 years, it suddenly just had a massive, exposure to a random new novel coronavirus. If we didn't have Wuhan for luck, Jeffrey, we'd have no luck at all, my friend. Okay. And so I think that they thought they were going to blame this whole thing on the Chi-Coms. And when they found out, no, this is part of the partnership effort, that the guidebook might be in Mandarin, but the fingerprints are yours. The money came from you guys. This is part of our great global partnership, okay? And with our most favored trading nation in China, and that you will not be able to isolate China as the foe to this because you guys wrote the checks for it. And I think that they absolutely, at that point, panicked, weren't really sure what was out in the Gen Pop. I think that they wanted to concoct a scheme. I think at first they were absolutely afraid they might have unleashed Captain Trips on humanity. And so I think this was done at first because of that panic. And then as time went on, I do think this became, which you're intimating now, this was now a pandemic to serve a vaccine rather than a vaccine to serve a pandemic. And so now they were not only going to be the villains, all right, that handed a book of matches to arsonists in Beijing. They were now going to be the heroes that saved all of humanity with their instantly developed vaccine, which was sequenced off of the same virus that the same sequence from the vaccine came from. I think that's why the virus mutated so fast, because I think the alpha strain of the vaccine is the virus that many of us were infected with. And that's why this thing kept mutating so fast, all right, because the vaccine was the virus and the virus was the vaccine.
So do you think there was a lag of time between, let's say, the Olympics, where I'm pretty sure the U.S. officials became aware of this flu, right? Mm-hmm. That likely was. Do you think there was a lag in time between that moment and the discovery that this was really Peter Daszak, Eco Health Alliance,
yes.
Eric.
I don't think Anthony Fauci knew that. Whenever let's assume, you and I have been published in major, publications around the country. Let's say you got to have something like that in 2 to 3 weeks before publication date. So we're kind of looking at 1st of February, Valentine's Day, maybe at the latest. There's a radio interview that Fauci gave to AM 990 in New York City. And in late January, where he says all the same things about the COVID virus that he says in that New England Journal of Medicine article, where he's essentially trying to calm fears. It's not that big of a deal, right?
He would say that it would be a kind of a severe flu, like
correct.
Yeah.
And I think that is in that window of time. All right, it's whenever those things happened, and that
between February 1st and February 15th,
somewhere in there, they figured out that bleep. we're the we're the baddies. That's where I think they found that out.
Yeah, makes sense. And so Fauci, when he wrote this article in New England Journal of Medicine, which I assume, you say it came out on the 28th. So let's just say he was writing this 2 weeks earlier, something like that. And he's just looking at the epidemiological data on it and says, okay, well, the deaths are concentrated in the old and the infirm. Based on my calculations, this isn't going to be that serious. Everybody should just kind of go about their business, which is more or less what he said in the New England Journal of Medicine. But between the writing of that article and that article's appearance, he had clearly changed his mind about what they needed to do, and that change of mind might have been triggered by his new awareness that his friend Peter Daszak had been up to no good, and working with his Wuhan lab on gain of function research, and that Ralph Barrick himself might have had a hand in creating the technology, or the technology that led to the creation of this virus.
And so it's not just that they were doing the gain of function research, which the Obama administration banned. Sometime early in the Trump administration, it picked back up again, and I've never really found out how that occurred. Maybe Fauci just thought with the change in administration, there wouldn't be as much oversight. It'd get lost in the shuffle. They just kind of begged for forgiveness later rather than ask for permission. But they weren't just doing dangerous gain-of-function research. They were doing something in order to cause what they termed, quote, spillover potential. All right. They were specifically. So I've always defined to my audience, to make it as simple as possible, gain of function research is dropping the atom bomb on the Bikini Island to see what happens. Okay. Spillover potential is when you put a person inside on the island to see what radiation does to the person. All right. And so that's what they were doing. They were trying to specifically provoke these viruses, which may never leap from animal to human. They may never ever not stay confined to their own places. They've been there for thousands of years in many cases already, and had not spilled over. They were specifically in those Wuhan labs provoking these viri, I guess, and prompting them to find out what will cause it to now essentially become a pathogen for human beings. And so this wasn't just playing with dynamite. This was like dynamite laced with arsenic. That's what they were doing.
So we're talking about mid-February. Fauci begins to change his mind, and that is consistent with everything I know. Actually, I think there was some interview that he gave to the Washington Post somewhere in this period where he said we can get out of this pandemic without a vaccine, which is strange because they had already been.
Remember, he told the media they could take their spring break trip still if they wanted to when they first asked him about it. Remember?
Yeah, very strange. So he changes his mind now, and now you've got. Rod Rosenstein's sister, Nancy Messonnier of CDC, warning New York Times, the Washington Post, and other people that a lockdown is coming already. Oh, and then by the 28th of February, the New York Times is all in. Now they're running that op-ed by Peter Daszak called "This is Disease X. We've known it was coming. It's here." And on the same day, they ran an article by Daniel G. McNeil called to take on the coronavirus. We have to go to medieval on it, and they, that was the same day. This was February 28th. So, but now you still have 2 weeks to go before the Trump administration throws itself into the idea. So,
well, that brings us to the Imperial College survey. That essentially was what prompted the Western governments in particular to go ahead and lock down, was that survey.
And that survey was circulating privately when?
I was first told about it in early March. And then they released it publicly, I believe, on March 16th, the day that the lockdowns began, I think is the day that they released it publicly.
And the same day as the first shot was administered in the trials. Okay. But they've known about it already for 2 weeks. Now, Trump was meanwhile on Twitter for the first 9 days of March saying, look, yeah, sure, it's going to be a flu. We'll get through it. It's going to be fine. Everything's under control. Suddenly on March 10th, he seems to reverse himself and say, we're going to use every effort of government to control this virus. By March 12th, he's got the travel restrictions that he gives that weird late evening press conference, or not press conference, but speech. On the 13th, we get the declaration of emergency. And I forget what else happened on the 13th. I guess was it the PrEP Act? I'm not sure. But then we got a whole weekend to go. And during this weekend is where, Birx and others report that they persuaded Trump to lock down. I don't actually believe that. I think it probably already happened already. But the 16th is the very famous press conference and all. And that's when the Imperial College model comes out.
Right. If you go to that model, and I had been casting a lot of doubt on just this sudden jamming technique. We were seeing stories out of Italy of bodies being burned in streets and everything else. I'm like, and then I would go on the Italian health data website, and hey, there's a serious issue in a couple of pockets, but this doesn't look like a Hammer horror film whatsoever, let alone The Stand. Okay, and so I'm like, the data from the beginning just did not add up with the panic. And I had a couple of close friends of mine that I won't name because they're very well known in conservative media. And they shortly thereafter came to me and apologized and saw the error of their ways. They sent me the Imperial College survey and said, Steve, I really think you might be wrong on this, brother. You need to read it.
Before it was public?
This was the day that they made it public is when they sent it to me.
On the 16th. Because, I guess you exist in the ecosphere of what's typically called, right-wing or conservative media, right?
Right. Yes.
And is it your recollection, because it certainly is mine, that these people they're all sort of xenophobes in a way, which is fine, but that they were approving of locking down. That was your, to some extent?
It was, there's a reason why kind of this odd coalition from right to left emerged of people who aren't typically together to push back on this, because there were various agendas on every side that were both affirmed and also challenged by what went on here. Okay. And I sat in this, in the very man cave where my studio that I'm talking to you right now, as I was sitting in this very room that night. And I remember reading that survey and my heart just sank, after I read it. I thought maybe, this might be it, man. I've got my kids and stuff upstairs. This might be a cataclysmic event, the stuff of, TV shows.
Yeah,
and
there's still an apocalyptic mindset, right?
Exactly.
On the right.
Yes.
There is. Not God's going to punish us, but kind of God's going to punish us.
Yes. And so I remember the still small voice in the back of my head said, hey, take a deep breath, read it again. All right. And then I want you to, and then do some research on Imperial College. So I read it again. And when you read this study again, it says right in the early part of the study, I'm paraphrasing here, but it says right at the beginning, towards the beginning, that they have no idea how coronavirus has spread. Now, forgive me, but if you're writing a study and that you're giving to all the major Western governments in this hemisphere, telling them they need to shut down to stop the spread of coronavirus, but you're admitting you're not sure how the virus is spread, there's an obvious few follow-up questions there, I would think, that never got asked. And I did some research, and I think the gentleman's last name is Grantham. I think Jeremy Grantham, I think, is his name. And he's a billionaire and one of the biggest backers. He's kind of a Miss Havisham of Imperial College, kind of a backer. And he funded an institute there at Imperial College that had another study come out right alongside of the mainline scientific study that we all read, and another study that essentially, so Jeremy Grantham has been fighting what he calls a, quote, 500-year-old war against fossil fuels. And this is his big thing, right? That fossil fuels are going to be the end. He's a climate alarmist. And literally 5 minutes after this Imperial College survey comes out that shuts down the world, his institute that he has sponsored at that same university has ready a paper that says, now that we are paused, we should reevaluate our choices. Back to that Cell article that you quoted here at the start in your prelude before our conversation started, that essentially this is the time to roll back the clock. Now, pre-industrial revolution, internal combustion engine, and we can now live in a communal way so that we're not harming Mother Earth anymore.
This was the Great Reset, and then you had the hilariously, almost clownishly opportunistic World Economic Forum come out with their idiotic book on the same topic, right? Right. Just a few weeks later.
And the other thing that made me suspicious right away, because I'm thinking, listen, I can't go out there and just be right-wing guy against all of academia. That's like every stereotype of all time. I wanted to debate whether the earth is flat while we're at it, right? Okay. Yeah. But what also drew my attention is the biggest critic of the Imperial College study were several scientists at Oxford. They criticized it right away. And then I start looking around and I get introduced to a guy named Dr. Tony Katz at Yale University and Harvey Risch at Yale University. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Other major academics are pushing back on this data right from the jump. So this, because I did not want, listen, my faith says to love my neighbor as I love myself. I do not want to get into an ideological battle if human life is at stake. That's not the time for it. All right. Yeah. And so I did not want to be someone that was peddling false information, that was causing people to be harmed when they otherwise would not be. And so I was actually very cautious in how aggressive I went back on this. But once I saw that other major academic institutions who do not align with me on most things, all right, when they were also pushing back on this from the very beginning, that's what really emboldened me to go ahead and hit the gas pedal from that point on.
Harvey Risch, and you said Katz, what's his first name?
Dr. Tony Katz at Yale was another one. John Ioannidis at Stanford University was another one that I read. Yep.
And his article, Ioannidis' article, came out, I think I'm going to say on March 18th, March 19th, March 20th, something like that. Very soon after the lockdowns began. But Katz, I think, had an article that the New York Times of all people,
New York Times wrote, or published, correct?
Had run like mid-February or something like that, saying, "Look, everybody just calm down. This is going to be okay." We had the data. That's the amazing thing about it. Months before the lockdowns, we knew who the vulnerable populations were. And I remember even Psychology Today ran an article going, everybody just relax. We know how these viruses work, and we've got the tools, we've got the therapeutics, we're going to be fine. And suddenly all that was just thrown out the window. I think that's the point that a lot of the more nefarious forces in the West realized, never let a good crisis go to waste, that this meets multiple different agendas, not to mention, a president we don't like. And if we can get him to shut down his economy in a presidential election year, maybe get rid of this guy, I think lots of different advantages or agendas, I think were sought by what happened that year. I would say that's so. Here's my list of the top three motivations. One is, in one fell swoop, you get rid of Boris Johnson, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and then and Donald Trump. Right?
Correct.
By convincing them to do the worst possible thing that's contrary to their political interests. So that's one. The other is we get modified mRNA technology out there. And
remember, Moderna had never successfully brought a product to market once as a corporation until Operation Warp Speed. Not one single time.
And then you had a third motivation of basically covering up for the Fauci, Daszak, Barrick culpability in the lab leak itself. So that's three very strong.
And maybe one of the most dastardly retcons since Nero blamed Christians for the fires that he started in Rome is the group that you just mentioned with their hands on the murder weapon. They wrote the checks to create this thing, then trying to retcon themselves ex post facto as the heroes saving Western what's left of human civilization. That is some sinister crap right there.
Yeah. Now, how do you weave into the story Event 201 and Crimson Contagion, these sort of theatrical practice runs of pandemics? Are those just things that the government runs all the time, and are they sort of unrelated, just sort of coincidentally happening at the same time in 2019?
That's a hella coincidence. If it is, and they just all had their talking points ready to go, and they just all had their policies ready to go. No, Jeffrey, I save all my faith for Jesus. I don't have enough faith to believe in that much coincidence. I just don't. I don't have any faith left. All right. So no, I don't believe that was all coincidence. Now, do I think it was just, puppet mastered the entire time? No, I don't think human nature. I mean, listen, if this was truly as well coordinated of a conspiracy as some of our own audiences think, some schmuck in Des Moines, Iowa named Steve Deace would not have been able to debunk much of it from his basement and write 2 best-selling books. All right. I mean, they would have unalived me long before it got to that point. What I think is, though, that a lot of their agendas, this was essentially wish fulfillment to them. You talked about, a lot of us on the right look at some of the cultural trends in America and look at that and kind of doom scroll and say God is going to judge us, right? Okay. Well, in the elite circles, they've got their religious dogmas as well, and so I think that they were absolutely prepared for a moment like this to occur, where they could hit the gas pedal and then say, "Hey, this is the moment to assert our agenda full throated." And I think that's what happened here.
Sure. And I'm sure you would agree with us. I got the very strong sense that on the center left and the left, that the pandemic became a kind of allegory or a big storied metaphor for what Trump has brought to the country. So Trump has poisoned us all.
Right.
A pathogen is loose. They call it SARS-CoV-2, but really it's Trump. And probably.
And I'm never going to take a Trump vaccine, and then a year later, I'm going to I'll take your kids away from you if you don't take the Trump vaccine that I took.
That's
yes.
Right. So masking became a kind of public symbol of
Correct.
I hate Trump, because the air we breathe is poisoned by a bad president. There was definitely that element.
And the Trump administration, unfortunately, played into this, but they did it from a good motivation. I think that they understood that he was a very divisive figure, and they really were concerned about public health. And they really didn't want people to not take the right medical advice because it came from him. I think they're more aware of all the trend lines that you and I are talking about than even we are. They live them every day, and so they kind of anointed almost this Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx. To kind of like this duopolistic prime minister and assistant prime minister status, where they basically spoke to the rest of the country that doesn't want to believe anything Donald Trump says. So, that they would be seen as more objective figures of information, so they would get the best medical advice. But when they did that, essentially, from that moment on, Anthony Fauci was running the United States government, and they created a figure that they then feared to fire because the backlash against them would be too harsh. And so they were, and who does a great job cataloging this is Scott Atlas does in his book. When he was finally brought in to be on the coronavirus task force, and just how outright intimidated by Anthony Fauci the entire Trump West Wing was, because they knew they couldn't go up against a symbol.
Do you think so? You're describing a situation where the middle of February, the press is more or less reasonable. People were calm. The New York Times was publishing cats. I mean, everything. Psychology Today was saying, "Calm down. Everything's going to be okay." The left is upset about things like, what they considered to be like anti-Chinese, people trying to avoid Chinese. Chinatown or whatever, they were that discriminatory. So do you think it was mainly Fauci's personal influence that flipped that?
100%. 100%. The greatest PR offensive for one individual that I've ever seen in the history of American media is what happened with Anthony Fauci over the course of the next 6 months. 100%. And essentially, it eroded whatever credibility with normie America that Donald Trump still had left. And he just never fully got the reins of his presidency back. And the closest he came was when he got COVID, and they used him as one of the trial patients for the antibody treatment that the Biden administration would then ration when all the southern red states needed it a year later. All right. Yeah. And Trump basically credited it with saving his life. And that was, I think, when Trump got back on the right message about where we need to go as a people, but we were now in the final month of the campaign. And you saw how close that race was, even with all the alleged shenanigans and everything else. You wonder if Trump had gotten to that place by Labor Day, that entire election process. I mean, regardless of what you think of that election, the certified results are that Joe Biden won the decisive 6 states by about 64,000 votes. Okay. That's an incredibly slim margin, right? If Trump had remember, they were still having problems in the White House about reopening schools in August. Okay. And the teacher unions were coming to the White House and everything else and saying, we can't teach, we can't do this. Right. And my home state of Iowa with our governor, We were the first state to fully reopen everything for kids, even sports programs. We had all kinds of AU programs and everything else coming to Iowa because we were the only place that they could actually come in and play even outdoors. And so the White House never got back on offense on this virus until the president got sick, survived it himself, got the antibody treatment that was revolutionary at the time, and realized that, hey, even we've got treatments for this aside from the vaccine. This doesn't have to be a panic. And that was, by then though, Jeffrey, he'd lost the plot. It was too late.
Yeah, and then we shouldn't forget. I mean, I'm not sure, you were probably way more aware of this than I am, but my impression is that the mail-in ballots did make a significant difference in voter outcomes in that election.
100% they did.
And those were pushed. The CDC announced that everybody should use mail-in ballots on March the 12th, 2020. Right. So they were already anticipating this. Do you think?
Can we go to that, by the way, because there was a key moment that happened here. And one of the key subplots of this that never gets discussed is the Wisconsin primary in April. All right. So remember, the Wisconsin was actually, I believe, the first state to reopen, but it was by state Supreme Court decree. Right? Georgia was the first to reopen by governor decree. Florida and Iowa were next, but Wisconsin reopened first by the state Supreme Court decree. And so Wisconsin held in-person voting for a primary in April. And I remember this because we sat back on our show and waited for the public health data for 2 weeks. It takes 2 weeks for a full spread from a mass event, right? That's what they told us. And we looked at the data 2 weeks after the Wisconsin state primary. You know what we saw? There was absolutely no margin or no significant difference in what public health officials in Wisconsin were reporting in terms of the spread of coronavirus when they had the primary and in-person voting. Now in-person voting was down compared to what it normally is. A lot of people still chose to vote by mail. But when you look at that relative to how everything was shut down, Jeffrey, that was one of the most in-person events we saw during all of lockdowns was that Wisconsin primary. And it did not lead to any, after the fact, significant spread of the virus. And that's something that a lot of people missed at that time.
That's right. Do you think I was on a podcast with you yesterday? I think it was your own show, and I had speculated that one of the ways and that there were two messages that Fauci, Birx, and whoever else that approached Trump sometime between March, say 9th and March 15th. To persuade him to go along with the lockdowns. One, it would be only 2 weeks. Second, if you don't do this, millions are going to die. 2 million people are dead. But third, we are going to have a vaccine probably by the summer. Now, I have no evidence for this at all. But what do you think about that idea that Trump expected the antidote to this pathogen to have been distributed a lot sooner than it finally was?
I think we can debate whether that's the timetable he was given, but I guarantee that's the paradigm he was given. And if anybody I know lots of people that have worked in and around the White House, and the president is the consummate salesman. He might be the greatest brander this country has seen since P.T. Barnum. You don't go to the president with negative scenarios without a solution. That's just not how he's wired, right? And I'm sympathetic to it because I'm the same way. I don't believe in the Kobayashi Maru, Jeffrey. I don't believe in the no-win scenario. All right, I break into Starfleet headquarters the morning before and reprogram the damn thing. All right, so I can win. All right, and Trump is that on steroids. And so I think absolutely you present to him a draconian measure that puts his entire presidency in existential stakes. He's not going to do that. He's just not wired to do that. Look at when it just comes to inflation this week, how difficult it is for the president to show any level of things could be better. It's just not who he is. All right. It's just not how he's wired. So there's no way you get Donald Trump to self-immolate unless you tell him it's temporary and you're going to actually be the hero of this play on the other side. You're going to be the deliverer of this. Yes.
That's what I've always suspected. And they somehow managed to, well, you talk about sadistic. Like if you thought the vaccine was actually going to work, that you would deliberately delay it until after the election, which we know for a fact that Fauci did. He kept sending back the test results saying, no, we can't do it yet. We can't do it. And yet it was like, what, So it was released like 2 days after the election.
Yeah,
I mean,
January.
That's just crazy.
And then the first national rollout, they started having all the
January.
healthcare workers and everything else do it by the end of the year, and then the national rollout was in January. Yeah.
Yeah, just appalling. I want to go back. Well, it's not quite back, because it was exactly in this time frame that there was some experiments at seroprevalence tests. There was one that was conducted in South Dakota that ended up being shut down, but the ending results of it were already, they shut it down in December of 2020, but the end results of it were showing a 60% seroprevalence already by November, December, which is extremely spooky. Now, it's true that South Dakota was one of the most, well, I don't think the state ever locked down, really.
No, in fact, I did an anti-scamdemic event in late April of 2020 in South Dakota, and that's where I actually got COVID. Was then, all right, and it was terrible. It was terrible for about 24 hours. I was struggling to breathe and everything else, and then it just went away. And I thought it was COVID. I had all the symptoms. And when I got back home to Iowa, I went and got an antibody test. And a few days later, the results came in, and they were like, if anybody's ever had COVID, brother, you did. Okay. So yes, well, that's why I actually got COVID.
And now you knew you had immunity. That's great.
Yes.
But so seroprevalence might have been higher in South Dakota just simply because there was more of an opportunity to sort of catch it, I guess.
But remember, we had the Stanford study as well that Bhattacharya and a few others did. And the San Jose, was it in LA or SoCal or NoCal? I can't. Santa Clara. Thank you. So NoCal. And it showed that the virus had already been there and well circulating for months, which would make sense. I mean, that's Silicon Valley. You're taking visitors in from all over the world year round. There's conventions there year round, right? Would make sense that there was a lot of exposure to that.
So what's amazing about this, Steve, when you consider just the fullness of everything we talked about, the whole thing just sounds like the craziest film plot you could ever.
I know. I almost feel like I didn't live through all of this. It's crazy to say. Now that we're not in it anymore, it's like, did this really all happen? Yes,
I know. Yeah. It's just like if you'd written a film script with this, like Hollywood would reject it on grounds that nobody would believe it.
Right.
But if this is right, that we had already achieved something approximating endemicity by November, December, what that means is that even if the shot had been effective in a public health sense, and even if it wasn't actually dangerous, that it might never have been necessary because endemicity had already been achieved.
Oh, I'd go even further and say that because they sent a leaky vaccine out there, because of what you just said, and they injected a bunch of people who already had natural immunity, T-cell immunity, with a leaky vaccine, I think they actually made it worse. I think they caused the thing to devolve and to mutate even worse. And one of the craziest things I had said to me throughout that entire process was by Dr. Robert Malone, who, of course, just left as the ACIP committee for CDC. And he said this to my colleague Daniel Horowitz and I off the record at Christmas time of 2020, I think it was Omicron Christmas of 2020, or was it Christmas of 2021? One of those 2 years. And he said he's of the belief that someone leaked that variant, because that essentially was the end of the most malicious phase. Remember Delta? Remember they kept getting worse, and Delta was actually worse than the original strain. Remember this, all right? And then Omicron came along, and essentially that made it way more inert than it ever was before. And Dr. Malone flat out told us that he thinks someone, and where did Omicron originate, if I recall, in South Africa or in the southern African states where there was the lowest vaccination rates. And he believed that someone just went ahead and leaked that and put it out there in the world to stop them from continuing to do what they were going to keep doing, which was just keep, the more you jab, the worse that it is. All right. And so I think it actually made it worse.
So it was the Omicron was a kind of a vaccine itself. I mean,
yep, kind of a natural vaccine. Yep. Yeah. An inert form of the virus that whoever had not yet been infected now had natural immunity by the weakest variant of the virus that we had yet. And so now we have herd immunity. Yeah.
To finally stop this energizing of the variants that was being caused by the vaccine itself. Yeah. Unbelievable. God, am I out of questions? I don't believe that I'm out of questions. I think we could talk for about 3 weeks about all the details.
I'm not going to sleep tonight now, Jeffrey. I just want you to know that.
Now, So
I had retired this to the bowels of my brain, and you just drug it all back up, brother. Thank you
right.
for that. Yes.
Well, Brownstone, we obsess about this. At least I do. Obsess about this stuff constantly. But, and we've both worried, I think, certainly I have for a long time, that this would all be swept under the carpet. And I'm feeling, as a result of the Morens indictment, and also the new focus on Fauci and other factors that are going on here, and also Rand Paul is now pushing for Fauci to basically be arrested for perjury, which
his pardon, that would not apply to his pardon, obviously. So that's the thing. It would not. No, that does not apply. That's why if he were to go and testify again, that would be a crime. That's why there's no incentive for him not to testify again, because he had the previous pardon for his crimes. If he goes there and perjures himself before Congress, that's something completely separate. Yeah.
So, but anyway, it's trending again. The topic is trending. I'm grateful for this, because it's one of the most frustrating things. This is why I put out that covidjustice.org site. It's a COVID resolution. It's been so frustrating for me that the story never really had any kind of closing chapter, right? I mean, it just sort of faded.
And my theory about that is, if you look at some of the worst examples of man's inhumanity to man that we've seen in the West, and the first two that come to everybody's mind obviously would be chattel slavery and the Holocaust. If you look at the northern states, they might not have been anti-prejudice, but they were anti-slavery. Many of the folks who lived in the South were poor whites who couldn't afford to take part in the institution even if they wanted to. And my point being, when it was finally time for a reckoning on slavery, there were enough people who I guess we'll say had herd immunity from the social contagion that they could say, you know what? Yeah, we need to hold those folks accountable for the thing I didn't do. You see what I'm trying to say? I didn't take part in it. I wasn't a part of that. So yeah, we need a reckoning on that. Same thing. I mean, that enough Germans who can say, "Oh, I never went to a Nazi party meeting. I didn't belong to the SS." I'm ashamed of what I've learned my nation has done. In this case, all of us took part in this. All of us followed the arrow in the Walmart shopping lanes, telling us how to walk. All of us, even the bro dude with the 24-inch pythons, listening to Joe Rogan, made sure to mask up his little Lily before he took her into Costco every day. We all did this to ourselves. And so there's not a critical mass of people, Jeffrey, to say, yeah, you know what? We need a reckoning on this, because it's kind of like that Spider-Man meme where all the Spider-Men are pointing at each other. There was such a critical mass of our society that did something they were ashamed of, took part in something they never want to do and admit to ever again, that this has kind of just become what happened in COVID stays in COVID. Mistakes were made. Let's all just kind of move on. And I think that's why there's not been the public outcry for justice, because I think a lot of people, including just a lot of normie people and regular people, took part in things and did things and succumbed to things they're not really proud of, and reliving that. I think they don't really feel like they have the moral authority to go back and relitigate that, because they were a co-conspirator. And I think that's why we've not seen the reckoning on that we saw on chattel slavery or the Holocaust or other. And I'm not ranking these things. I'm just saying in terms of, cataclysmic events.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Well, it's very similar with the Great War. It involves so much sacrifice, so much conscription, so much mass mob behavior that there was not really a reckoning after that either. So another thing happened today was Ron Johnson's a very compelling hearing where he presented all sorts of evidence that the FDA had essentially gamed the VAERS results to ignore safety signals of the shots.
Yes.
This is a big issue for him. And I watched a lot of that hearing, and I found it very compelling. I just think it's interesting that all this is happening at once. Exactly.
And I think that I believe in a creator, and I think that despite our frailties as a species, the universe made in his image bends ultimately to justice. It may not happen in the way that we always want. It may not happen in the timetable that we always do. But ultimately, the universe, a purposeful universe and a design universe, takes on the characteristics of its designer. And I think that ultimately it does bend to justice. And I think, and that's where I think random things that we can't explain, and this kind of takes us full circle in our conversation. Random things we can't explain, like out of nowhere, one of Anthony Fauci's bad lieutenants literally sends a bunch of emails and says, "You'll never catch us. We could have never predicted that in a million years." And I think that's the kind of stuff that just, Al Capone for tax evasion, not for the St. Valentine's Day massacre. The kinds of things that just kind of happen, okay, because ultimately the universe does bend to justice, ultimately.
It's going to be interesting to watch. Thank you, Steve Deace. It's so wonderful to be with you, and I've enjoyed talking to you for this last hour. Let's keep in touch, okay?
You bet, brother. God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.